in my opinion. Thank you, and I will be happy to take questions.
I'm going to lead off with a question, which is to ask you.
And now, I can wait. I can take the microphone.
You can, but I've got it. You can't have it back yet. Just a minute.
You see, you let them get a foot in the door, right. And that's that.
The podium.
But I can get rid of the glasses.
Here's my question. This document was drafted at the end of the 18th century. We're heading into the 21st century. If it were more specific rather than as vague as it often is, would it have survived, or would it have had to have been, you know, much more amended than it's turned out to be? That's my question.
That's an excellent question, Barbara, and thank you so much for asking it. I didn't have to pay much. I think it's the genius of the document that it's vague, that we can look to it to find notions of who we want to be. See, what really disturbs me about this denying the notion of fundamental justice by conservatives, and by the way, don't make the mistake of thinking I'm personally liberal, because I'm very conservative on a lot of issues. But we are a country where the Constitution was drafted to ensure fundamental liberties. The Constitution was not something that was drafted as a bloodless document. These were 55 men who met over the course of 4 months, and it really was remarkably difficult. If any of you have not read the story of the constitutional debates, it's an amazing story. People came and went, and the conditions were truly awful. But they stayed there because they understood to have a country, A, you have to compromise, B, you have to put forth what you believe to be the country that you see serving all of these people, and a lot more, since everyone knew the nation was expanding. So a specific document, would it have lasted? Well, you can keep amending it, but it wouldn't have lasted and created the country we have now. I think we all need to remain cognizant that a country of fundamental justice is the country we want. I don't think we want a country where someone says, well, you know, 1,200 black men were lynched between 1890 and 1902, but unfortunately the law doesn't give us any choice on how to deal with it. Well, maybe not, but maybe it does too. Let me put these down, and then I will take more questions. Yes, sir.
It sounds to me like what you explained is really a cautionary tale about the tyranny of the majority as much as what's going on right now. Isn't that really fundamental what it comes down to? Is when the majority wants something, eventually it happens, whether or not individual rights may be sacrificed in the process.
The question was, isn't this, I'm going to repeat the questions because only I'm mic'd. Barbara did not see fit to take someone else's question. Isn't this a question of also the tyranny of the majority, which is Madison's great fear? The answer is yes. We always have to fear that a majority will impose its will on the electorate, on the population, in such a way as to deny rights, to deny justice to people in the minority. And it is also true that anyone who is in power isn't going to give it up unless they are either forced to or voted out. So what it means is that those of us in the majority, when we are in the majority, in order to have the kind of country we want, we should be aware of the power that we wield as a majority. And those of us in a minority at any particular time, because these shift, should be aware that they have to work and push that their voices are heard too. There's no one answer. Democracy is a very, very sloppy system. It is sloppy, it is inefficient, but it is the other choice. You get things done. President Obama said this is a State of the Union message, and whatever you feel about President Obama, he's right about this. If you have a country where a government can just tell everybody what to do, you can be extremely efficient, but not particularly free. We have chosen in our country to give voice to lots of different kinds of people and lots of different interests, and that's going to lead to a lot of inefficiency. So yes, it is a tyranny of the majority issue, and it's something that you try to deal with varying degrees of success over time. Anyone else?
I'm going to see back. There's
No.
one over there.
I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Since there are so many stark examples of real inequality between what blacks and whites had available to them, especially in areas such as education, transportation, medicine, and so forth, weren't these facts ever used in cases to try to actually challenge the doctrine of separate but equal?
What I don't quite understand. Were people?
Well, on a daily basis, blacks had inferior accommodations. They had crummy hospitals to go
I
to.
understand. The answer is staggeringly no. In Plessy, Albion Tourget, who was a northern lawyer, who the people who were mounting the challenge engaged, never used the inequality of the accommodations in his argument. It was stunning because he wanted a complete constitutional victory. So he never went to the court. And the other interesting thing about Plessy was that the railroad companies didn't like the separate car law because they had to put on extra cars because you can't, instead of just filling the ones you had, they always had to have an extra car for blacks, and sometimes the first class cars for whites weren't full. So they might have helped the plaintiffs in Plessy get the separate car law overturned, but the equality was never mentioned. So Tourget, who is thought very highly of, made, in my opinion, a huge blunder there. And by the time the law was challenged on the basis of inequality, the precedent had been set, and it wasn't until Brown, which Brown applied only to schools, let's not forget, did not apply to a broad segment of rights, just to schools. It took to Brown before the justices were willing to acknowledge inequality as an argument against segregation. Yes, ma'am?
Do you want to address the argument we are hearing here in Arizona, and I think you've heard about our birthright citizenship arguments, and about the people down at the legislature who want to mount a challenge to the 14th Amendment that it doesn't include, they never intended to include people who were just born here in the United States. Have you given that any thought?
Yes, I have. It's a very interesting, the funny thing about strict constructionists or textualists is that they believe in the text of the Constitution, and only the text of the Constitution, until it goes against them. There is, for example, nothing in Article 3 that grants the Supreme Court the right to say what the Constitution means. There is no right of judicial review in the Constitution. And more than that, Blackstone, who the English legal theorist, who conservatives venerate, said you should never let a court overturn a law of the legislative act because then they become despotic. But Antonin Scalia, in the same speech that I quoted from, said, well, there is one exception to textualism. Judicial review isn't in the Constitution. We made it up. This is his words. But we made it up for a very good reason, because the Constitution is a kind of super law. And as Justice Marshall said in Marbury versus Madison, the opening case in every constitutional law textbook, it is the job of the Supreme Court to say what the law is. Well, that's not completely true. Marshall kind of made that up too. So the textualists have said, well, we really like the power to say what the law is, so on that there's an exception to textualism. In the 14th Amendment, is there an exception? Well, if you believe in a living Constitution, then we can debate what the intent of Congress and the state legislatures who ratified the amendment, what their intent was in writing that amendment. Did we really intend to apply it to the children of illegal immigrants, say, or simply to make sure that every freed slave was a citizen? But if you don't believe in intent, if you are a conservative, if you are a Justice Roberts or a Justice Alito or a Justice Scalia or a Justice Thomas, or I don't know your local justices, but the ones here, forget it. The 14th Amendment, the fairly understood meaning of that phrase is, you're born here, you're a citizen. So I can't answer, but what I can say is those people who are screaming about judicial activism have no right to talk about the intent of the 14th Amendment. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
A fairly orthodox view of the American political system says that the Supreme Court, once the justices are appointed, are insulated from, politics, and that's wonderful. Obviously, the appointment process is very political, but once justices are appointed, do you subscribe to the orthodoxy about the court, either then or now, or do you see channels of political influence on the court? And I thought I heard you say perhaps influencing it right now to turn it in a direction that you find sort of alarming.
The question was, do I subscribe to the notion that once justices are appointed, they become free from political pressures? Is that, or do I think that they give in to political pressures? I'm tempted to say I was stunned at the number of justices who went against their own ideology in Bush versus Gore, but I won't do that. I don't believe necessarily that justices are influenced by outside pressures. They have been in the past. The Chase Court that I talked about certainly was influenced by outside pressures. But they are influenced by their own reading. They are political in that, not that they're running for office or that they're hobnobbing with lobbyists, although Justice Thomas's wife is a lobbyist, but that they are political in that they see the country in a political way. These justices, the one in the courts I wrote about, they saw the country a certain way. The population simply did not want to share resources, accommodations with black people. And the court took the amendment and contorted it to such a way as to make it impossible for black people to have the rights that they were granted in the amendments that were passed after the Civil War. Today's justices, I believe, bring a political point of view to their decisions. Not cynically, not sneakily, it's who they are. And to go back to the other question, it's the genius of our democracy. Madison essentially said, democracy works best when you lock a bunch of people in a room and they come up with something that doesn't work completely for everybody, but works a little bit for everybody, and then there are some people who are going to be really unhappy, and some people might be more happy. Well, that's right. And I think the court is like that. I don't see this as a conservative or liberal issue, but I think that the court is political in that the people, to get to the court, they are political beings. And once they're on the court, they see the law in a certain way. The Citizens United case is another, the corporations having free access to political contributions, is another example where the justices' ruling said, hey, this is a corporations have a right of free speech. Do I think corporations have a right of free speech? Well, doesn't matter. Nothing about it in the Constitution. There is nothing in the Constitution that says you must make a corporation, give a corporation personal rights. And interestingly enough, there's a case before the court now where the justices, where AT&T is asking for personal privacy rights, since they have personal rights as a corporation. And the justices, including the conservative justices, are dancing around trying to get around it. And Justice Roberts said something like, well, sometimes the noun is different than the adjective, or some silly, that squirrel or squirrely mean two different things, because they are stuck with what they've done. So the answer is, yes, I believe they are intensely political, but it's not necessarily that they're getting phone calls in the middle of the night from John Boehner or Mitch McConnell telling them what to do. But they don't need to. We have 3 political branches of government, not 2. But one of them is appointed for life and can't be removed without impeachment, which is almost impossible. Yes, ma'am.
Your book talked about social Darwinism being
yes.
the pervasive belief at the time, which is
Yeah.
what you're talking about now. And could you explain what that meant at that time? What society?
The question is about social Darwinism, which was a late 19th century kind of crackpot theory, as we view it today, which was very popular at the time. What happened was Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which said that over time, species will change to adapt to whatever conditions they happen to be in, and the more fit, not the better, will survive. Survival of the fittest, by the way, Darwin never said that. Darwin said whatever variation of that species, whatever mutation, best fits the environment within which it is living or competing for food, that will survive, the less fit will die off. A number of theorists, starting with Herbert Spencer and then William Graham Sumner in this country, said, hey, wait a second. What this really means is that, and Spencer started survival of the fittest, that was his phrase. What it means is that in society, the groups who do well are doing well because they deserve to do well. And the groups that do poorly deserve to do poorly. So the rich are rich because they should be rich. And most of the rich were white. The poor are poor because they're inferior. They're not fit. They're not fit to this society. They may have qualities. They may be able to do certain tasks. But in a modern society, the best are going to do well, and the better and the worse are not. Now, this is really appealing to rich people. Because it said not only are, you got rich not simply because you did whatever it took to get rich, sometimes legally, sometimes not, but you got rich because you deserve to be rich. So the Andrew Carnegies of the world and the John D. Rockefellers loved social Darwinism, and it had a number of devotees among the court, not the least of which was Oliver Wendell Holmes. So in a country where this popular notion that black people are doing poorly because they're inherently inferior, and that was part of it, it is going to make the court very leery of enacting or upholding legislation that's going to artificially raise a group that didn't deserve to be raised, because that waters down society and makes society worse all along. So, and social Darwinism was around and probably in its heyday until the first decade of the 20th century. And of course it fits into National Socialism and the master race and all of this. Right now we all laugh at it. It's a crackpot theory, but they didn't laugh back then. This gentleman first. Yes.
I'm reading the legal cases of the Civil War by Robert Murray, and Justice Bradley is rather prominent in that. And it shows, for instance, in the legal tender cases, how the change in the personnel of the court certainly makes a change in the outcome. You mentioned that all the presidents appointed some of the justices each, and I'm wondering whether they were Northern Union justices or whether they were from the South as well, because if they're Northern justices, they certainly seem to be out of step with the members of Congress and the Senate who enacted the legislation to implement the 14th and 13th and 15th Amendment.
Most of the justices who were appointed were from the North, disproportionately from New England, or at least born in New England, and they were not out of step. They may have been out of step with the radical Republican. What you had with the radical Republican Congress was a committed minority forcing through a very, very extreme social agenda that they believed in so fervently that they made sure to crush all opposition. Those amendments, equality under the law. Now, the country thought something should be done for the slaves. Slavery was abhorred, and some provision should be made. But sharing a restaurant, sharing a hotel, sharing a railroad car was every bit as unpopular in the North as it was in the South. The justices who were appointed, many of them, at least right after Lincoln and right afterwards, were abolitionists. And they did not believe in equal accommodation. Lincoln himself abhorred slavery, but at least during his first term, thought blacks were fundamentally inferior. The great thing about Lincoln is that he grew, and the first person he showed his second inaugural to was Frederick Douglass. So people were capable of growth, but it was a widespread view that you were dealing with a group of people who were inherently inferior and that you didn't want to share with. So these Northern justices may have been out of step with the radical Republican minority in Congress, but they were not out of step with mainstream America.
Larry, I'm going to take the microphone back. Ha, it's mine, so I get to keep it. I'd like to add a quick coda, and then I'd like to just take a little time to talk about some of Larry's other works, since we are, after all, a bookstore, and you might actually want to buy something. 50 years ago, as an undergraduate, we were required at Stanford University in constitutional law to read the entirety of the Federalist Papers. For those of you who haven't or don't know them, they were basically a pitch by the drafters of the Constitution, some of them, about why you should adopt it. And the one that has stuck with me all these years, and the one I think applies today more than any other, is Federalist Paper number 10, in which it says that should a day come when the majority does not hold and a tyranny of minorities arises, our system will fail, which is where I think, to a great degree, we may be headed.